This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to kind of unpack something, a moment in history that might make you rethink how World War II got started.
Oh, wow.
And it all starts with a U.S. gunboat called the USS Panay. And it's this event that seems really small at first, but then it had these massive ripple effects.
I see.
So picture this, 1937, Japan's military is getting stronger and stronger, and things are getting really tense over in Asia.
Yeah.
In fact, at the same time as all this is happening, Japan was carrying out what's known as the Rape of Nanking in China, a brutal event, just horrific, and the death toll was staggering.
It's in this chaotic environment that we find the USS Panay.
Yeah.
Sailing on the Yangtze River, clearly marked with American flags. They were helping evacuate American citizens who got caught in the crossfire.
Yeah.
Think an American ship would be safe, right?
You would think so.
Yeah.
But get this. Japanese aircraft attack the Panay.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't just a stray bomb or anything. It was a deliberate attack. 3 Americans were killed and a lot more were wounded.
That's awful.
You'd think, okay, this is it. The U.S. is going to step in, right?
You'd think so.
Ready for payback, right?
Right.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The U.S. response was so restrained, it's shocking.
Right.
No declarations of war, no immediate counterstrikes. They just accepted an apology from Japan and basically moved on.
That's unbelievable.
It's crazy to think that just a few years later, the U.S. and Japan would be locked in this just brutal war.
Yeah.
So what was going on?
Yep.
What was happening in the U.S. that made them respond to an attack on their own Navy with, well, a shrug? To unravel this, we're diving deep into a history podcast called The Panay Incident and U.S. Policy in Asia. It's really eye-opening, honestly.
It sounds like it.
The podcast talks about this feeling of isolationism that had really gripped America.
Oh, interesting.
It's hard to even imagine now, but back then, over 70% of Americans, at least according to a Gallup poll they did at the time, were against getting involved in any foreign wars.
Wow, 70%.
Yeah, they were still really haunted by the horrors of World War I.
Oh, I bet.
And they just did not want to get entangled in anything overseas.
Yeah.
And this is what led to the Neutrality Acts.
Right.
In the 1930s, these were laws that basically tied President Roosevelt's hands when it came to intervening in foreign conflicts.
So it was like the U.S. had just put up this big do not disturb sign for the rest of the world.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about laws, though, right?
Right.
The podcast also talks about how public opinion really played a big role.
Absolutely. Public opinion was huge. Americans were struggling back then. I mean, the Great Depression had hit hard, and people were just worried about, putting food on the table, not what was happening an ocean away.
Yeah.
The podcast really emphasizes just how weary and disillusioned people were back then. They just wanted to focus on their own problems.
So isolationism wasn't just some political strategy. It was really reflecting what people were feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes sense. But the podcast also highlights another piece of the puzzle, the economy. It turns out the U.S. and Japan weren't just political players. They were really connected economically.
That's right. The U.S. was actually Japan's biggest trading partner back then.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, companies like Standard Oil, they were really invested in that region.
Wow.
So putting sanctions on Japan would have really hurt American businesses, and that was a risk Roosevelt was not willing to take.
I see. So we have Roosevelt, and we know he was actually pretty sympathetic to China, and he definitely saw the threat of Japan.
Right.
But he's got Congress that's all about isolationism, and he's got the public that wants nothing to do with war, and he's got businesses that are totally reliant on trade with Japan.
Yeah, what a mess.
What a mess.
Yeah.
It was like he was walking a tightrope.
Totally.
He managed to send some financial aid to Chiang Kai-shek's government over in China.
Right.
But he also rejected calls to join forces with Britain.
It's all very complex, and to this day, historians are still debating what Roosevelt's real motives were.
I bet. It's wild to think about how all this, stuff from almost a century ago is still being debated.
I know, it's crazy.
It really shows how history is never really settled.
It really isn't.
But okay, let's shift gears for a sec.
All right.
One of the most interesting things this podcast asks is, why did the U.S. underestimate Japan so badly?
It's a great question.
This is a country that would soon launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
Right.
How did they miss all the warning signs?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder.
And it's a question that historians have been trying to figure out for decades.
Right.
I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, of course, but the podcast points to a few things that really contributed to this huge misjudgment.
Like what?
Well, one of them, and it's hard to even talk about, is racial and cultural bias.
Oh, wow.
It's crazy, but some officials back then, they had these prejudiced views about the Japanese.
Yeah.
They saw them as inferior when it came to technology, like they couldn't really challenge a major power like the U.S.
It's hard to believe that prejudice like that could actually shape such important decisions.
I know.
I guess it really shows just how common those attitudes were back then.
Yeah, unfortunately it does.
Sadly.
And this bias, it wasn't just limited to a few people, it was everywhere.
Really?
Yeah, in the media, pop culture, even in some government circles.
Wow.
So basically, this led to this widespread underestimation of Japan's military and what they wanted to do in Asia.
So you're saying that racism literally blinded the U.S. to the threat Japan posed?
I know, it's crazy to think about,
It is.
but it's true.
It's chilling.
Yeah, but the podcast also says that there were other reasons
Oh, okay.
why the U.S. underestimated Japan.
Oh,
It wasn't just prejudice.
Right. But another factor was geography.
Mm,
The Pacific Ocean is huge, and it created this sense of distance, this false sense of security almost.
right.
It was easy to think that what Japan was doing was just a far-off problem,
Yeah.
something happening way over there that didn't really pose a threat to us here.
Yeah, I can see how that distance could create a buffer, like mentally, like
Right.
out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing the U.S. wasn't completely ignoring what was happening over there.
No, not completely.
Okay.
But their attention was definitely divided.
Yeah.
Remember, this was the late 1930s, and the world was on the verge of another war.
Right.
Hitler was getting more and more aggressive in Europe, and that was taking up most of their attention.
So it was like they were so focused on the fire in front of them that they didn't see the one smoldering behind them.
Exactly.
Wow.
So Japan's actions in Asia, while concerning, were seen as kind of a secondary problem compared to what might happen in Europe.
Right.
This focus on Europe, plus the racial bias and the geographical distance, it created a perfect storm of miscalculation.
And that miscalculation, well, we know it had terrible consequences.
He did.
But even after Panay, even after it was clear that Japan was a serious threat, there were still different opinions in the U.S. about how to deal with them.
Right, and the podcast does a really good job of explaining the different schools of thought that came out after Panay.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so one school of thought, the isolationist school, argues that Roosevelt was really limited by how much the country wanted to stay isolated.
Makes sense.
He might have seen the danger, but he couldn't really do much about it politically.
So they're saying that Roosevelt was stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, pretty much.
I see.
But then there's the internationalist school, and they have a different take.
Okay.
They argue that Roosevelt was actually a really smart strategist, that he was playing the long game.
Oh, interesting.
He knew about Japan, but he also knew the U.S. wasn't ready for a war.
Right.
So he bided his time and slowly tried to get the public to be okay with getting involved, while at the same time making the U.S. military stronger.
Okay, so two very different views of the same events.
Right.
One sees Roosevelt as trapped, the other sees him as, like, this master chess player.
Exactly.
It's amazing how history can be interpreted in so many ways.
I know, it's fascinating.
But wait, the podcast mentions two more schools of thought.
It does.
What about the economic determinism school? What's their take?
Well, like the name suggests, they focus on how the economy shapes U.S. foreign policy.
Okay.
They say that big business interests, especially the ones that were making money from trade with Japan, had a lot of influence on Roosevelt's cautious approach.
So it's the classic follow the money argument. They're saying that sometimes money matters more than anything else, even national security.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Wow.
They point to the fact that even though things were tense, the U.S. kept supplying Japan with important stuff, like oil and scrap metal, right up until Pearl Harbor.
No way, really?
Yeah.
So in their view, Roosevelt was putting profits over being prepared.
I mean, it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
But they do say that the economy was a big reason why there wasn't a stronger response to Japan.
Got it.
And lastly, there's the realist school.
Yeah.
They see Roosevelt as a pragmatist, someone who understood the limits of American power and acted accordingly.
So he was basically working with what he had.
Exactly.
Okay.
They say he knew that going head-to-head with Japan in the late 1930s would have been a disaster
Yeah,
because America wasn't ready militarily.
that makes sense.
So the realists are saying Roosevelt was waiting for a better time to challenge Japan,
Yeah.
a time when the U.S. was in a stronger position.
Okay, so we have these four schools of thought, each with its own perspective on what Roosevelt did and why he did it.
Right.
And we know Japan didn't stop with Panay.
Yeah.
They kept expanding in Asia, which, of course, led to Pearl Harbor.
Right.
It's almost like Panay was this warning shot, a preview of what was to come.
It was definitely a turning point. Even though it didn't lead to war right away, it showed how vulnerable U.S. foreign policy was.
Right.
And it hinted at the big conflict that was coming.
Yeah, for sure.
But the impact of Panay wasn't just on the U.S. and Japan.
Oh, right. We were going to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
How did the Panay incident and how the U.S. responded to it impact things on an international level?
Well, for one, it gave a boost to other aggressor nations like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy.
I see.
They saw that the U.S., even though they talked about international law and democracy, wasn't willing to actually do anything to defend those things.
Yeah.
It made it seem like the U.S. was all talk.
So they thought they could get away with stuff.
Yeah, it created this feeling that the rules didn't matter anymore
Wow.
and that aggressive nations could just take advantage of the situation.
So the U.S. not doing anything actually made things worse.
Basically, yeah.
It's like their inaction created this vacuum where other countries felt like they couldn't rely on the U.S.
Exactly.
that had consequences all over the world.
It did. Countries that might have stood up to aggression were now afraid to because they didn't think anyone would back them up.
That makes sense.
The failure to stop Japan in the 1930s really did have global consequences. It helped break down the system of international relations that had been set up after World War I.
It's like the classic example of appeasement, right?
Exactly.
And we know how that usually ends.
Sadly, yes.
But what about Japan? How did they see the U.S. response to Panay? Did they think America was weak, or was there more to it?
That's a great question.
Thanks.
And it's one that historians are still debating.
Oh, I bet.
Some say that Japan miscalculated, that they thought the U.S. was too weak or too isolationist to do anything in Asia.
So they mistook caution for cowardice.
Yeah, that's one interpretation.
Well, okay.
Others believe that Japan was actually being strategic.
Hmm.
They knew the U.S. was powerful, but they thought they could get what they wanted in Asia before America could react.
So they were racing against time.
Exactly.
They knew they had a limited window to become dominant in the region.
That's right.
And that whether it was a miscalculation or a strategy, it turned out to be a huge mistake.
It did.
A mistake that led to another world war. But before we go there, I think we need to remember that Panay wasn't just about politics and military stuff.
Yeah.
It was about real people, the sailors who died, the families they left behind, and all the people whose lives were changed forever.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get lost in the big historical events, but we can't forget the human costs.
Yeah, it's important to remember that.
Panay was a tragedy. It reminds us that even events that seem isolated can have huge and terrible consequences.
You're right.
It's a sobering thought and one we should keep in mind when we study history. But as much as we want to talk about the human side of all this, I think we need to move on to the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We're back, and man, diving into this Panay incident has been really something.
It has.
It's amazing how this one event, like the sinking of a U.S. gunboat, can show us so much about what was going on in the world right before World War II.
It's like a snapshot of a world that's about to explode with all these big powers clashing, different ideas fighting each other, and you can see the seeds of conflict being planted.
And like we talked about, it wasn't just about the U.S. and Japan. It really affected the whole world, emboldened those aggressor nations, and kind of helped break down the whole international system.
Right. It shows that doing nothing, or even just seeming weak, can sometimes have these terrible consequences you don't expect.
Absolutely. It's a powerful lesson about how important it is to stand up to aggression and build alliances and use diplomacy,
Definitely. Panay shows what can happen when a country doesn't make it clear that they're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior.
But it's not just about being strong militarily, right?
Yeah.
The podcast also talks about how we need to try to understand other cultures and challenge our own biases.
Absolutely.
And to realize that things happening far away can still have a big impact on our own lives.
Exactly. Even back in the 1930s, the Panay Incident shows how connected the world already was.
Yeah.
It highlighted how important it is to communicate clearly, be sensitive to other cultures, and really engage with the world in all its complexity.
It's a message that's still relevant today, I think, in a world that's even more interconnected and complicated than it was back then.
Definitely.
So as we wrap up, what do you think is the most important takeaway from all this? What should our listeners be thinking about as they go about their day, see those news headlines, make decisions?
I think the biggest thing is that history isn't just some boring list of facts and dates.
Right.
It's alive. It's still shaping who we are and what we do.
Yeah, I like that.
The Panay Incident, even though it happened so long ago, teaches us so much about conflict, diplomacy, and how important it is to be involved in the world.
It's a good reminder that even things that seem small can have huge ripple effects, changing the course of history in ways we might never expect.
Exactly. Panay was a terrible tragedy, but it was also a turning point,
Wow.
a wake-up call that helped the U.S. and the rest of the world stand up to fascism.
Yeah.
And as we deal with all the complicated stuff happening today, it's important to remember the lessons from the past. Learn from the mistakes people made before us, and work together to build a better, more peaceful world.
I love that. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks.
Big thanks to our expert for guiding us through this deep dive into the Panay Incident. It was amazing.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
I hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
I hope so.
And remember, history is an ongoing conversation.
It is.
We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, dig into the sources we talked about, and share your thoughts with others.
Yeah, share what you think.
Because the more we engage with history, the more we can learn from it.
For sure.
And the better equipped we are to deal with the challenges we face today.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that conversation going.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.